in green as their lining. We also need to decide where the grain line's going to go. If I'm kind of knocking something off or being very inspired by something, I will check, I will stretch it to see where the grain line is. It turns out the grain line is on center front and on center back for these pieces. So you'll be putting a grain line an inch away from the center back there. You'll be opening this piece up and putting the grain line on the center front fold. Okay, so then these pieces are done. Woohoo! I'll bring out the hole punch and you'll have that. We're not doing manila. We're just going to do brown paper. It's just, I want you to have the experiences of doing these interesting things without the tedious stuff of the other things. We'll save that for your final dress.
Appreciate it.
Okay, so here's what our outer pieces are looking like. So we're going to work on the front first because it's the easiest. So I've traced off the front pattern. I needed to add a 1/2 inch along the bottom because the front or the outer dress is 1/2 inch longer than the underdress. We're going to be doing a cutout here and taking the cutout piece and slashing and spreading it for this little thing. This thing is called a godet. A godet is generally a triangular shaped piece of fabric sewn into, usually it's into a seam. In this case, it's just sewn into the dress.
How does
And
spell godet?
G-O-D-E-T. And then there's a little section in the book on godets. We're following page 285. Okay, so this is more of a stylized godet. It's not a perfect triangle. It's more of a wide house shape that we're then going to spread and add more fullness. This would be an appropriate replacement for a slit. Often it's on, they put them in slim skirts and then they stick a little godet in the back so that she can walk. She doesn't need a kick pleat or a vent. It's just a nice little way to do added fullness so she can take a bigger stride. Or it's just decorative. In this case, it's decorative. So I took some measurements of this one to see how we could make our own version of it. We're not totally knocking this off exactly. We're definitely changing the bodice. But this is also a size 10, and we're making a different size. So our pieces aren't going to be exactly the same size as this. All right, so how is that going to work? So the picture on page 285 has a godet that's curved. Ours is just going to be angled. And what it is at the center front, it's 11.5 inches high to the top point. Okay. At the bottom, it's 4 inches wide. So I put a little tick mark at 11.5. Oh, and are we adding hem allowance? Let's look at this. No, this guy's called a marrow hem or a marrow rolled hem or a machine marrow rolled hem or whatever. It's basically a 3-thread overlock set with a very small bite, and the stitch length is like tiny. It's like a 1 stitch length or even smaller than that. And so it basically overcasts your edge really tightly, and if you use a contrast thread like this, it just looks like contrast binding. So we do actually have a marrow machine here if you choose to make this or use this kind of seam finish on your own final dress. It's often done on these lightweight fabrics, georgettes and crepes and things. But I would definitely test your fabric first, because sometimes the fabric is too loosely woven to hold this kind of stitch. If your fabric is one of those fabrics that just frays and falls apart and you go to try to marrow it, the marrow might pull the fabric off. So I would test your fabric before you commit to doing this.
And then if your fabric was that kind but you still wanted to do this dress, would you just do like a really small roll?
You can turn it and then marrow it. Sometimes that'll help.
Double.
Yeah. Yeah, but MERROW, I think. Yeah, it's the name, it's the brand of the machine.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, or the brand of the original one, and now any machine is
Like
just called that, like Kleenex, yeah.
So 11.5 from the
11.5
bottom up,
from
and
the
then,
bottom to the top point.
and then you
It's
mentioned
4 inches wide at the
4
bottom.
inches wide.
So it's 8 inches.
So we've got 4 inches cut out here and 11.5 cut out here. Okay? Let me get that out of the way. So 11.5, 4. This side piece, I have written down 9 inches.
So we work with the side seam,
Center
extra
front.
allowance. We work with the allowance all together, right?
From that little extra ½ inch we added. So from there up to 11.5.
And you said the other side was 9 inches, at the low part of the peak?
So this is,
Including the seam allowance.
there's no seam allowance.
Oh, no, it's the center,
Yeah,
you're right.
center front,
Yeah.
center front. No seam allowance. We did add a
Center
½
front.
inch there, but that's not seam allowance. It's
All
just
right.
making the skirt longer. 4 inches, 11.5, 9.
And that's parallel to the
No.
center.
Not parallel. She had to make it more difficult. So what I like to do is I like to square up a 4-inch line, at least 9 inches long. And then I measure up 9 inches. And at that 9-inch level, I go in. And in our case, if it's 3 3/4, I'm just going in 1/4 inch, creating a new point to draw a line to.
1/4 inch.
Yeah, 3 3/4 is our width here. So 3 3/4, 4 inches minus 3 3/4, 1/4 inch. And then I connect these new dots. Okay, so once I've got that little slanty house shape, I'm going to cut it out.
Listen,
Bless you. Then the outer skirt piece, the main part that's not the house shape piece, this guy needs seam allowance now, where I cut that out because I've got to now sew that piece once it's fiddled with back in. So I need to add seam allowance to here. So this piece is now ready to go back on brown paper, and I'm going to add seam allowance here. I don't need to add hem allowance because it's a marrow hem. I don't need to add seam allowance here and here because it's already there. So I'm just adding it here and here.
and that's a ½ inch.
Yeah. Okay, so that piece, that's easy. That's just more cutting. Okay, this piece is where we're going to do some fun stuff. The book has you just cut it almost in half. So you'd start in the middle and cut and leave that little thready bit hanging off. We're going to add even more fullness than that. I feel like I can get a much smoother curve line if I slash a few more times. Because what we're doing is we're slashing and spreading, and then we're blending the edges that we get into a gentle curve. If I slash it more, then I've got more control over where that curve is. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this little piece and divide it into fourths. And I think the easiest way is to fold it in half and fold it in half again, especially since it's angled. It would be hard for me just to do the measurement. Fold it in half. And then we're going to put an even amount of spacing. We're going to flare these out an even amount in between each one. So this is going to feel like the flare skirt that we just did, except the flares before were determined by the amount of pleating we had. Here, this is just extra added fullness. We're just adding more room than the basic was allowing for.
So if you have a flared section like that and you're laying it down trying to figure out how much they added, what do you just like do it on the fold and then just kind of lay your pattern piece next to it? and
Or
see if you
measure.
do?
You know, we could measure the bottom of that godet. I kind of did it by eye, and I made my little sample, and I decided for my next go round, I think I want to add even more. It just wasn't, it didn't have as much kind of flippiness to it. So that's what second drafts are for, is to go in and add more. So I added here an inch and a quarter between each.